My name is Judy Molland, and I'm a recently got on the board, if you like, of the Rattlesnake Creek Watershed Group. And that is who is sponsoring this event this afternoon. Just briefly, I know a lot of you are very familiar with our group, but the purpose basically is to protect, preserve, restore the Rattlesnake Creek watershed, and also to have people really appreciate and respect the area and treat it with respect also. So that's sort of who we are. I'm curious to find out how you excuse me, heard about us. Not heard about us, but heard about this event this afternoon. So just by a show of hands, how many of you saw the beautiful posters that we put up? Aha, okay. I'm not counting, I'm just like, okay. And then we had a piece on Facebook, we have a Facebook page, so maybe some of you saw it there. Great. And then there were various other community events where you might have also seen. So we have the, okay, one over there, great. So anyway, that's to find out that. I wanted to share with you a little bit of how we do this work on protecting, using community outreach, using education, science. I was one of a group 3 weeks ago that stood outside Five Guys on Van Buren, and there was a lot of cheatgrass and weeds there. So we spent a chunk of the morning just pulling them out. And FYI, we only got halfway, so I'm going to be putting out an email to get some more help to finish the job. And then 2 weeks ago was a cidering event, which maybe some of you were there at the Rattlesnake Market, where we had maybe 150 people who brought their apples and pressed their apples and drank their cider. And part of the point of it also was to make people aware of being bear resistant. And so teaching them not to leave apples on the ground where the bears can come, and rather to prune their apple trees and take those apples off rather. So that was also part of it's part of what we do, is to make people aware of how you can be bear resistant. So that's some things that we've done, and we have a newsletter that comes out once a month. And so if you want that newsletter and you're not already signed up, that's the sign up place over there. So today's presentation, which you've probably noticed, it is being recorded by the Missoula Community Access Television, MCAT. And this is part of a media assistance grant donated to us by MCAT, which means you will be able to listen after the fact, and you can tell other people about that also. So, on to the main show. We are delighted to welcome Leif Fredriksson today. He's the director of the Public History Program in the History Department at the University of Montana, where he teaches Missoula history and the history of cities and the environment. Intriguingly, with several friends, he is also co-creator of the podcast named Death in the West, which is like, okay, nice title. I just moved here not that long ago from England. Should I? Never mind. Anyway, Death in the West. Okay. Okay, so today, as all of you, I believe, can read, he is going to be talking about the history of Chinese burial grounds in the lower Rattlesnake, talking about what we know about the Missoula Chinese community and the burials here, as well as the broader history of burials in Missoula, and how those burials have kind of figured into the history, development, the memory of the town of Missoula. That's all I have to say. Okay.
All right, well, thanks for having me. And if I ever don't get the mic close enough to my mouth, just let me know. Yeah, I'm Leif Fredriksson. I'm the director of the Public History Program at the University of Montana. And I'm going to talk today about the cemetery that was in the Lower Rattlesnake, which was used by many different people, and in particular, the Chinese burial ground that was there. And I'll spare you too many caveats and that sort of thing, but this is not like I just finished a book on this, this is more like I've just started researching this and putting together some materials and thinking about it. So it's a work in progress, but I got interested in it in particular as I was developing a historical tour of the Lower Rattlesnake with Sally Thompson, a historian and archaeologist in Missoula, and we got a grant from the Missoula County to develop this historical walking tour. So thanks to them and the Historical Museum for providing that. And part of that was that we wanted to do something on these Chinese cemeteries, which I had heard a little bit about. I grew up in the Lower Rattlesnake, and when I grew up, I had no idea that there were Chinese burials. I had no idea there had been any kind of cemetery in the Lower Rattlesnake. I grew up just blocks away from the place that I'm going to talk about here. So it's very intriguing to me. So we wanted to include some of that in the tour. So we did some sort of initial research on that to include that in part of a broader tour of the Lower Rattlesnake. But I got really intrigued by it and started looking through all kinds of old newspaper articles and so on. So a lot of what I'm going to present here is that, what I've found there. And there's also been sort of a general growing interest in the history of the Chinese in Missoula, which has been great because that history has kind of been forgotten in a lot of ways. And the city council has just approved a memorial for the Chinese cemetery in the Lower Rattlesnake. There's other people that are working on research into this area and so on. So I'm not necessarily even the person that knows the most about some aspects of this. And there's lots of questions that remain. But I thought it would be nice I haven't actually seen a sort of, presentation of this history in a sort of attempt at a cohesive way yet. So I thought that might be useful. And I wanted to mention also, this is the Lower Rattlesnake and Greeno tour that you can sign up through Unseen Missoula, and we've worked with people from the Rattlesnake Creek Watershed Group to give that tour. So thanks to them for this event and for working with us on that. And I just wanted to mention also, as I said, that there are lots of other people that are doing interesting work on this. This book just came out, and we just read it, my Montana history class that I'm teaching this fall, a really amazing book about the history of the Chinese in Montana. And there's been a lot written on the Chinese, well, a fair amount written on the history of the Chinese in Montana. But what's really great about this book is that it gives more of a perspective of the Chinese themselves. There was lots of research into documents and letters written by Chinese and translated from Montana. And so I'm not going to be able to give a lot of that in this lecture that I'm giving, but if you want to learn more about that, it talks about Missoula in here and also just the Chinese in general in Montana. That's a really great book. All right. So it's helpful to get, to talk about this history, to get a little overview of the history of Missoula itself. This place has been used by indigenous people for thousands and thousands of years, basically since the land became habitable after the last ice age. So there is a very, very long history of human use of this area by groups like the Salish and the Kootenai and other Native American tribes in here. We're going to be, when I'm talking now about the history of Missoula as a city, is just a really small slice of the human history of this place. But in terms of the non-native settlement of this area, in western Montana, that really began with St. Mary's Mission, which was a Jesuit Catholic mission founded down in the Bitterroot in 1841. In the 1850s, as the Northwest was sort of incorporated into the United States, there was attempts to try to incorporate it not just politically, but economically and socially. So the federal government sent out railroad surveys in the 1850s to look for routes for building a railroad through parts of the West so you could settle that area, bring in resources, export resources from that area, and so on. So there were railroad surveys that went out in the 1850s, and beyond trying to survey for railroads, this was land that was occupied, as I said, by Native Americans. So there was a need to make treaties with Native Americans. And there's lots of history and problematic history of treaty making with Native Americans, of course. But in this area, the Hellgate Treaty of 1855 was the one that was made with the Salish, the Pend Oreille, and the Kootenai in this area, which basically opened up the Missoula area for settlement and development of transportation routes. And the first of those was the Mullen Road, a wagon road that was built in 1860, and then eventually the railroad. But after that first wagon road was built, the Mullen Road, one of the people that worked on that was a guy named Christopher Higgins, who came and settled back in this area, a place called Hellgate Village, a couple miles west of here, set up a little trading post, kind of right in the middle of the Mullen Road connected the highest point, or the furthest points of navigation on the Missouri River with the furthest points of navigation on the Columbia River. Missoula is almost right in the middle of that wagon road, so it's a good spot for a trading post. There's the 5 valleys that come together here, so it's a very good spot. So Higgins and his partner, Warden, came out and made this trading post here. And it's that same year, Missoula County was created. And then eventually, after a few years at Hellgate Village, when Higgins and Warden wanted to further expand the town, they decided to move over to the present day, downtown Missoula, essentially, because they needed stronger water power to power grist mills for grain and lumber and that sort of thing. There wasn't enough water power where they were. So they moved to a place that they named Missoula Mills, basically right across from the Wilma is where those mills were, and that became the kernel of Missoula as a city, and eventually just became known as Missoula. And it was really a pretty small trading town for many years until the railroad did eventually come through in 1883. And when that was built through, Missoula became one of the hubs of the Northern Pacific in this area, and it totally transformed the economy of this place. It made it possible to be a much more industrial, export-oriented economy, which brought in a lot of people, more people to live in this area, and so on. And it was in that same year then that Missoula was chartered as a city, an actual municipal government. So this is a bird's eye map of Missoula from 1884, just a year after the Northern Pacific came through. And the area, this is downtown. If you don't know, there used to be a big island in the middle of the Clark Fork. This is where the Wilma was, and in the 60s, this channel was closed off. So that's why it looks different now. But you can see this is where the town site is, spreading out from there, and eventually spreading into the Rattlesnake, which is up here. All right, so there were, as I said, there were people that lived in this area for thousands and thousands of years. So of course there were things done with the deceased, including burials of those bodies, and there have been a number of burials of Native Americans found in the Missoula area, which is not surprising at all because they use this area extensively. And when non-natives started to move into this area, that really began in the 1850s. There was some early sort of, people grazing cattle and doing some, very early, before Missoula Mills was established, prospectors and miners and so on. They would have probably just, if somebody died in their group, they would have buried them probably pretty close to where they were. So there's burials in the mountains around Missoula and so on. And then when Missoula gets established as a town, there's the development of more sort of formal cemeteries and burial grounds. St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery is established. I'm not sure exactly when that was, maybe 1860s, maybe 1870s. The Higgins family established its own cemetery, which was at the south end of Higgins Avenue today. And it was for the Higgins family, but there are other people buried there as well. You look at the Missoula directories, which are like these old, sort of like a phone book, but with a lot more information in them. And it lists the cemeteries in the late 19th, early 20th century for Missoula, and the Higgins Cemetery is mentioned as one of those. Then there was Fort Missoula, which was established in this area in 1877. They developed their own military cemetery, the Post Cemetery. And then this sort of main public cemetery that emerged was in the lower Rattlesnake. So this is a little detail from, these bird's eye maps are very cool. They're really big. And so we're actually zooming in on a little part right here. And you can see in that little detail a number of cool things. One is that there's Native American teepees down here, showing that Native Americans don't disappear after the making of treaties, and despite all the challenges that they face from colonization, they remain. And so there's still Native American presence, here on this bird's eye map. But the other thing you see are these headstones of this early cemetery. Now, this is probably, these bird's eye maps are really cool. They have a lot of detail in them, but they're not always exactly correct. Sometimes they have features in them that never existed. Sometimes things are not in quite the right place. And as we'll talk about more, this cemetery was probably this is a little bit north of there, but it's roughly in that area, right? And again, this map's from 1884. So this lower Rattlesnake cemetery was kind of it was the main cemetery for the public. It didn't really have an official name. When you look at newspaper articles, it's sometimes just referred to as the cemetery east of Rattlesnake Creek, cemetery at the foot of Mount Jumbo, the village cemetery, which does suggest its use as a sort of the main public cemetery. Same with the Missoula Cemetery, and that's how it is referred to when Missoula is incorporated in 1883, and there's a discussion of the boundaries of the municipality. One of those boundaries ends in the middle of the cemetery, and it's referred to just as the Missoula Cemetery then. Sometimes called the East Side Cemetery, and then later, in the 20th century, referred to sometimes as the Cherry Street Cemetery or the Old Cemetery. Settlements, put cemeteries in different places. They usually didn't put them, they put them usually on the edge of town, somewhere they were not right in the middle of where people were doing things, but also not too far away. And you see a lot of them that are placed sort of, especially in the mountainous west, sort of at the base of the mountains on the edge of town. And that's, of course, where this is. That's also where the Higgins Cemetery is located, right? It's kind of at the base of where Patty Canyon comes down and so on. An area that's flat and so on. So this was the sort of public cemetery, but it has sort of emerged more organically than the cemetery that we have today, the Missoula City Cemetery. That was created in 1884. And it's, of course, located on the north side. And so in 1884, this main sort of, the main burial ground for Missoula's residents switches from this lower Rattlesnake area to the north side. Now, I don't know exactly when this cemetery in the lower Rattlesnake was created. There's a book by Alan Matthews, who's the former historic preservation officer for Missoula, that says it was used beginning in 1866, but I don't know exactly where he gets that information from, but it may have been used as early as that. Now, a lot of the people, again, even when Missoula was established in 1865 and afterwards, a lot of people probably would have just been burying people especially in more rural areas on the edge of town, just in their own family sort of cemeteries, right? So it may have been established in 1866, but was probably pretty small for a while. When the new cemetery was created in 1884, there was the reinterment of the bodies and gravestones from this old cemetery. And so the idea was you would dig up the remains of people, move their headstones to the new cemetery. And that gives a little bit of an indication of when some of these, some of this lower Rattlesnake Cemetery was used, because some of the headstones in the current cemetery are from there. There's people that are headstones from as early as 1869. I don't know for sure if they came from this lower Rattlesnake Cemetery, but this one did. This is from 1871, and this is the gravestone of two children of a guy named William Kennedy, who was one of the early entrepreneurs in Missoula. He built the Missoula Hotel, where the Mo Club is, and he became the mayor of Missoula. And he had two young children that died and were buried in the lower Rattlesnake Cemetery. and then eventually moved to the current cemetery. So these headstones, his youngest died in 1871, and were moved later, but that suggests that, you know, it was being used at least as early as 1871. And by the way, I'm part of the, you know, I'm gonna get to talking about the Chinese here, but part of it's really difficult to tell that story without telling the story of this Lower Rattlesnake Cemetery, in part because it's unclear in a lot of cases when, you know, later remains are found and so on, whose they are. Are they Chinese burials? Are they burials from this period that I'm talking about of non-Chinese people? So the first mention of the cemetery, this Lower Rattlesnake Cemetery, is in 1878 in the papers. They have, they're raising money to build a fence around the cemetery. So they have a big strawberry festival. This is organized by the Masons and some women's groups in Missoula. And they get together to raise a bunch of money, and it's a success. They're able to hire somebody to build a fence around the cemetery. And this suggests, you know, that certainly by 1878, it's well established enough that you can fence a number of graves in this area, and that the public, this is seen as sort of a public venture, investment in this public cemetery. Although the ownership of the cemetery lands is not really clear to me. It wasn't owned by the city, and it's not clear who managed it. It seems to have been this land originally was homesteaded by Charles McQuirk. I think it was Charles, one of the McQuirks, whoever here was the earliest, and got that land from the public domain, and then it was, over time split up and sold off and so on. But at this time, it was still in private ownership, and so it may have just been a sort of mutual understanding that this was land that would be used, by the general public for burial. Now, as I said, in 1884, that cemetery was shifted to a new cemetery on the north side, and the one that we have today. And that was initially a privately owned cemetery, and then in 1901 became owned by the city. So that, in that period, after 1884, more and more people start to be buried most people would be buried in this new cemetery on the north side of town. But that's not the end of the story for this Lower Rattlesnake Cemetery. In 1883, the year before that new cemetery is created, part of these lands in the Lower Rattlesnake are platted. They're already privately owned, as I said, but platting means you basically make a survey of it to subdivide it and start selling off lots for residential development. And this is, this is Van Buren Street. If you can't see, this is Cherry Street here, Poplar, and Rattlesnake, and then, Greeno Park would eventually be over here. But you can see the cemetery boundaries are outlined. The cemetery goes partly onto this plat that's been platted out in 1883. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this map is that when they platted it out at this point, they had Cherry Street. When it ran into the cemetery, it goes around the cemetery, right? So it's not going through there, and that is going to change pretty quickly. This cemetery, even though there's the idea that there's a new cemetery and that the bodies that are buried here will be moved to the new cemetery, that actually takes quite a bit of time. And part of what people are trying to figure out is who's actually buried there, who's buried in this cemetery. And they're trying to raise funds for upkeep of it, because even though there's a new cemetery, it's clear that that reinterment is going to take some time. And so they're trying to find funds to upkeep it. They're trying to find who owns it. They don't even know who owns these lands. And they're thinking about ways for citizens or the city to raise money to buy it so that it will be able to be, maintained at least for a while as a sort of legitimate cemetery. But this reinterment is very, very slow. And in the meantime, this cemetery does start to deteriorate. In 1885, the papers mentioned that only several bodies have been moved, so not a lot is being done in terms of reinterment. In 1886, there's another burial in this area of a white man. So burials don't even end here quite. They've mostly shifted to the other cemetery, but not entirely. And there's lots of complaints in this period in 1885 and the next few years about this cemetery going to rack and ruin, it falling into disrepair and so on. And that basically continues for decades after this. All right, so let's now come to Missoula's Chinese and their burial in this area. So Missoula's Chinese have, pretty similar story to the Chinese in the American West in general. They came out, initially there was a movement of many Chinese out to work in a lot of the gold mining areas. A lot of the Chinese would come out. Many of them came from areas where there had already been, a history of mining where they were from in China, so they knew how to mine. And they would go in and often work places that had already been worked over one time, and they would rework them and get more gold out of them and so on. And in Missoula, there was a big gold rush in a place called Cedar Creek, west of Missoula in 1869. Hundreds of Chinese come out to work in that area. Many of them end up traveling through Missoula, and some of them probably end up coming to stay in Missoula. Then the next sort of big influx of Chinese comes with the building of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Again, a classic story in the American West, the story of railroads. The Chinese build a lot of these major transcontinental railroads, including are the dominant labor force in building the Northern Pacific in western Montana. So thousands come out to work on the railroads. It's incredibly dangerous work. A lot of them die. And a lot of them are thrown out of work. Like the Northern Pacific will just hire them, and then all of a sudden they don't have any more work for you. And a lot of them will end up in Missoula because Missoula is one of these hubs of the Northern Pacific. So hundreds or thousands of Chinese will end up sort of being stranded in Missoula, and some of them end up establishing homes in Missoula. And in Missoula, in the urban environment, they work in places like laundries, restaurants. They are entrepreneurs. They develop mercantile shops. A lot of the gardening, probably most of the early sort of truck gardening, I mean, it was before we had trucks, but that sort of gardening was done by the Chinese in Missoula. And as in many of these places, there is a Chinatown that develops because of, implicit discrimination or restrictions on where the Chinese can live. They are only, they are confined to a certain part of the city. And that Chinatown is on lower West Front. So kind of on West Front closer to Orange Street, where Cranky Sam's is today and Biga Pizza. And that was also the red light district. It was sometimes called the restricted district, where, in other words, where, restricted people or restricted activities were restricted to. So that's where Missoula's Chinatown was located. Now, there was another classic story of the Chinese in the American West, is a great story of tremendous amount of discrimination, persecution, and violence against the Chinese. The Chinese were, many white Americans saw the Chinese as a race that was not amenable to citizenship in the United States. They were un-Christian, they were un-American because of their customs, and sort of regardless of all that, they were seen as being competitors, especially competitors for other wage laborers, but also competitors for other businesses, other laundry businesses and so on, restaurants and that sort of thing. And all of those groups, laborers, other competing businesses, sort of leaned their shoulder into Chinese persecution for a lot of reasons, including their own economic self-interest. But Chinese, this persecution against the Chinese happens at all levels. There's federal laws that are passed to exclude and deport the Chinese. There's been an earlier treaty with China that had brought over a lot of Chinese to work on the railroads when there was a need for that labor or a desire for that labor. And then after that, in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, and numerous other federal laws that variously restrict the Chinese. At the state and local level, there's all kinds of laws that are passed as well. Laws that don't allow the Chinese to marry with other races. Laws that don't allow the Chinese to serve on juries or to testify. And all kinds of other sort of local actions that are taken to boycott Chinese businesses, to pressure businesses and employers not to hire Chinese and so on. And then, in addition to that, actual direct violence against the Chinese. So you have cases in Missoula of the Chinese being attacked by Missoula residents, in some cases lynched, other cases badly beaten and robbed, and so on. This is actually this is a story from the Saturday Evening Post that comes later. I think it's from the 1920s, but it's a story about this sort of debt collector who goes around the American frontier west, and one of the parts of it is he goes to Missoula and he ends up collecting a debt against a guy that runs a Chinese person that runs a laundry, and this is one of the little illustrations from it. But I thought that would be interesting to contrast with this newspaper article that's from the 1890s, where the Knights of Labor were sort of a labor organization that were one of the organizations that was most virulently anti-Chinese and opposed to people hiring the Chinese for labor, wanted to restrict Chinese immigration to the United States and so on. And they're having a meeting here, and one of the complaints against the Chinese was that they would come and work in the United States and save up money and send a lot of that money back to their families, which was apparently a great sin, but the issue was that they other non-Chinese people saw that as not reinvesting that money in their community, and that's brought up in this meeting, and then this Chinese person happens to be there, and he says, "Yes, actually, I'm not reinvesting that money because the person that brought this up hasn't paid their debts yet." So there's the fiction, and there's a little bit more of the reality. And unfortunately, as I said, this not only happens in Missoula, but Missoula is actually one of the leading cities in Montana that is most anti-Chinese. And this is in the late. I mean, this happens from the very beginning when the Chinese are in the area in the Cedar Creek Gold Rush, but really picks up in the late 1880s and into the early 1990s. An extremely virulent period of anti-Chinese prejudice and violence. All right, so the Chinese burials. A lot of as I said, the building of the railroad was very, very dangerous, and a lot of Chinese died in the process of that, and were usually just buried alongside the railroad tracks when that happened. Sometimes, and that happened with other immigrants that worked on the railroad as well, Japanese and Greeks and Italians and so on. But they would often just be buried in sort of unmarked graves, and sometimes they were later moved to a cemetery. There's a lot of Japanese in Missoula Cemetery that worked on the railroad and were later moved to the Missoula Cemetery. But a lot of those bodies probably never left the side of the tracks. In Missoula, the first mention I could find of a Chinese burial in the city is from 1886. It doesn't say where the Chinese person was buried, but it's possible that it was in the lower Rattlesnake. There are some other interesting burials of people that have been found later in the 20th century that may also have been Chinese burials, may indicate where else the Chinese may have buried people in Missoula. One was a body was found on the north side on Charlotte Street, and it's not clear exactly what the race of the person was. The bones are not, there's not enough evidence there to sort of clearly identify them, but a lot of the bones indicate somebody that was of Chinese or Asian descent. There are also bodies that were dug up in the Higgins Cemetery on the south end or not bodies, but materials from graves that were dug up on the south end of Higgins Street that looked like the sort of materials that were sometimes buried with Chinese. So there may have been burials there as well. But it's not really clear to me where these Chinese that were living in the Missoula area in the 1870s, early 1880s. Not entirely clear to me where they were burying their dead, but it starts to be clear by the mid 1880s that they're burying them in this lower Rattlesnake area. This is the first newspaper article that I could find that explicitly says, talks about a Chinese burial on the lower Rattlesnake. So it's from 1888. It's a cook, a Chinese cook. That was another occupation that a lot of the Chinese did. They ran restaurants, but a lot of them also worked as personal cooks, including for some of Missoula's white elite. And And he's a cook, sort of a modest occupation perhaps, but there's a very large funeral, and they go out and you see a lot of these descriptions of Chinese funeral processions and burials. And again, that book by Mark Johnson goes into a lot of great detail about what the meanings of these funeral rites were for the Chinese, but they often had a lot of food and some other sorts of materials that would be placed on the grave to sort of accompany the dead person into the afterlife. But this article, even though it's the first one that specifically mentions the burial in the lower Rattlesnake, the way that it talks about it makes it sound like this was not the first time that this happened, right? Nor does it seem to be the first time that the locals made notice of a Chinese funeral. So it seems that Chinese funerals were going on for some time before this, certainly, and that they may have already been burying people up in the lower Rattlesnake for a little while before this. It's also a lot of the things that you see as when you're talking about the Chinese burials in the Rattlesnake are some sort of discussion of this food or other materials that are left on the grave as being stolen by Native Americans that are living in the area, camped perhaps on Rattlesnake Creek, like that picture I showed before showed. Now, we have to be really careful when you're reading these newspaper articles that are written by white people. They're not written by the Chinese. They're not written by Native Americans. It's a lens that, especially at this time, is very, very influenced by really prejudiced views of these groups. But you do see a number of discussions of Native Americans taking stuff from these graves. All right, so this is one of the a burial that was probably in the lower Rattlesnake because of the time period, 1891. And the headline for this is "Dead Mongol," and you see a lot of very derogatory terms used for the Chinese in these news articles. But this one talks about an even bigger funeral affair, 500 Chinese going out, and these funeral processions would go from Front Street. They would start there in Chinatown and walk up, and there'd be carriages and that sort of thing into the lower Rattlesnake from there. And eventually, when the burial grounds shift to the upper Rattlesnake, all the way up there. So they'd be these huge. You can imagine just 500 Chinese people. I mean, it gives you a sense of the scale of the Chinese presence in Missoula at the time. I mean, it's possible that's an exaggeration. I'm not sure that there were actually 500 Chinese in Missoula at that time. But nevertheless, there were probably a lot, hundreds perhaps, that were going up into the lower Rattlesnake. And again, you see is descriptions of these funerals. I mean, they sound interesting, and they were quite interesting to the non-Chinese population in Missoula. A lot of them would go out and watch these funerals or even walk up, along with them. One of the articles talks about the Kodak fiends, which is the photographers in this period, taking lots of pictures of these processions. So there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of sort of exoticization of these people as something, in other words, a group that is very, very different from the rest of the population. And that, in part, among other things, was one of the sort of indicators for non-Chinese people of, the Chinese being sort of unchristian and un-American, too different to be part of America, were these, these funerals themselves. But, this is happening at a time in Missoula when, again, there is an incredible amount of violence and discrimination against the Chinese. And I think it's important also to think about this as like a pretty strong assertion on the part of the Chinese of their cultural identity, despite all that's those sorts of challenges and discrimination that they're facing. And the idea for the Chinese in terms of their burial practices at this time, among other things, was that people would be buried initially after they died, and then a few years later, sometimes it's described as a couple years, sometimes it's described as 12 years, they would be dug up. The bones would be taken out of wherever. If they were in a coffin, they'd be taken out of the coffin or just taken out of the earth or whatever, and then sent back to China, right? So that would be the sort of proper burial for them, just as, a person that dies, if you're from the East Coast and you die in Missoula, you might be sent back to the East Coast. And that was, again, something, this reinterment of the Chinese with their the bones of their relatives that died was again seen by a lot of white people as this weird practice, and a practice that again indicated that the Chinese weren't really they weren't amenable to being American citizens, even though we have those Americans would have similar burial practices in some ways as well. So, as a result of some of these, the ways that these Chinese funerals, burials were perceived, you saw, among other sorts of attacks on the Chinese, attacks on these funerals themselves. This is, there's a big article in 1890 in the Missoulian, or one of the local papers, that's this deacon telling everybody about how they should observe the Sabbath. And he's got, I don't know, a dozen different sort of things that you should do. And at one point he says, neither should he stone a Chinese funeral. So, which indicates that, maybe that was a common thing to do the rest of the week. But just gives you a sense of like the sort of this offhand comment about stoning a funeral. I mean, it's just an amazing disregard for the humanity of those people. And then this, a sexton, by the way, is a person that manages a cemetery. This was the manager of the cemetery, the new cemetery that had been created in 1884 on the north side. And he actually wrote a letter to the paper decrying, the ways in which a lot of the Missoula residents were treating the Chinese in their funeral processions and their burials and so on. And, nevertheless, there's still, an insertion of some, derogatory terms, even in an argument, even in a letter like that. I don't think he wrote that headline, but he pretty strongly condemns a lot of the Missoulians' approach to these Chinese funerals. All right, so at the same time that this is happening, again, the new cemetery has been created in 1884. The Chinese are, apparently starting to bury their dead in this cemetery in this period. The lower Rattlesnake is starting to get developed. That plat had been, that first part of that lower Rattlesnake had been platted in 1883. And then in 1888, the other sort of half of the lower Rattlesnake is platted. This is called the Woody Edition. And here you can see the outline of the cemetery again. And this time, Cherry Street's not going around it anymore, right? It's going straight through it. The plats for the homes and so on are going to go right on top of it. And that's the idea. And you can see also here, this article that comes out at the same time in 1888 says the high-toned avenues in the new additions across Rattlesnake run right through the old graveyard. But that's no worse than to have cattle browsing around the yard and Indian cayuses tied up to the tombstones and stray pigs plowing up the ground. This, I mean, if you're ever wondering, one of the things, we're living through a housing crisis in Missoula, and there's a lot of talk about, expensive real estate and so on. But, and I think we're truly in a different period. But you also look back in the newspaper, and there's constant discussion of housing problems and real estate development and so on. And this one's talking about how, people shouldn't delay in buying lots in Missoula, in particular in this area in the lower Rattlesnake and so on. So a real push. There's a tremendous amount of pressure to develop land, real estate land, and that happens even when there's a cemetery in the way that may have still people buried in it or being buried in it. Now in 1893, there is the Poor Farm is set up in the upper Rattlesnake. In basically where Rattlesnake School is today. And in that, that year, actually, I'm not sure exactly what year the Poor Farm is set up. It's somewhere right around there, before this. You see Chinese burials that are now taking place up at the Poor Farm. Right, so now again, these Chinese funeral processions are going all the way up the Rattlesnake to where currently Rattlesnake School is. And one of the articles from this period mentions that the old cemetery, meaning the one in the Lower Rattlesnake, has been abandoned by the Chinese due to the close proximity of residences. And indeed, in 1894 and after, most of the Chinese burials that are discussed in the paper are either mentioned as being up in the Rattlesnake, up near the Poor Farm, or they don't say where they are, which indicates, I think, that there was a new sort of normal for where those burials were. But they didn't entirely end in the Lower Rattlesnake. And in particular, in 1900, there's 2 different articles about 2 different burials, one of which is talked about being at the old cemetery, so it's very clearly in the Lower Rattlesnake. Another one is the burial is talked about being across the Rattlesnake, which could be the Poor Farm, but was also typically how that older cemetery was described. So there was probably still burials going on in the Lower Rattlesnake, even if not to the extent that it had been before, up to 1900. There's also, in this period, things that are going on with the other sorts of uses of the previous use of the cemetery by the non-Chinese in Missoula. Reinterment of bodies from that cemetery has apparently continued to be somewhat slow. It's unclear, how many of those bodies have been moved, but it's clear from newspaper articles that movement of bodies continues well into the 20th century. In 1887, there's an article about the Knights of Labor moving some of their members from that old cemetery to the new cemetery. In 1893, that's when the ex-mayor William Kennedy moves his children's graves. So quite some time after 9 years after the creation of a new cemetery. And again, these aren't just, you can imagine that there are people in these cemeteries that were poorer, or maybe they don't have any family anymore and they wouldn't be moved. But there are also elite members of Missoula who still have family members in this old cemetery. In 1894, there's a mention of 4 soldiers still that are still buried in the old cemetery that are going to be moved. Again, throughout really consistently from the creation of the new cemetery, there is a continuing discussion, bemoaning the dilapidation of the cemetery, again, by sort of the non-Chinese members of Missoula society, indicating that there are still probably bodies there, still a need to upkeep that cemetery. And in 1908, there's a petition to remove bodies from the cemetery. So again, suggesting that there are still a lot of people buried there. And you have this article is also from 1908. So homes of the dead are neglected. You also have, nevertheless, continuing pretty strong, vigorous real estate development in the Lower Rattlesnake. Missoula has continued to grow and expand. The Northern Pacific came through in 1883, but then it has another expansion. Its trunk lines expand, and that brings more people and more business and workers to Missoula. The Milwaukee Railroad is built through in 1909. You have further development of the mills and lumber industry around Missoula, the creation of the university. And with all this booming population, people start to spread out more and more, and there's a need to get, it's no longer just a city that you can walk around so easily, and there's a need for public transportation. So you have the development of the streetcar system in 1910. And one of the things that the streetcar does is that a lot of the real estate development is very, very much tied to that. There's a sense of that people want to be living near the streetcar. Again, this is before the automobile, so, you don't really have another way of getting around except walking or being on a horse. And so, streetcars are very, very much tied to real estate development. And the Lower Rattlesnake does get a streetcar line eventually. But there's also a lot of sort of land speculation that's going on in the lower Rattlesnake. And the East Missoula Land Company takes out all kinds of advertisements like this in the paper, talking about how people can sort of get rich on real estate investment in the lower Rattlesnake. They developed this whole scheme where you will basically like agree to buy a lot in the lower Rattlesnake, and then you don't know which lot you'll get, how big it'll be, and some of them have houses on it, and then basically you're put in a lottery, and you may get a lot with a house, or you may not, and so on. So it's sort of a real, it's just a very sort of dynamic real estate market at this time. And in the lower Rattlesnake in particular, Greeno Park has been created in 1902. And the lower Rattlesnake increasingly becomes seen as a place, it's pretty close to downtown, so it's convenient, but it's also a place that's seen as a little bit separate, a little bit, a place that's sort of respite from the urban industrial city that's more taking place in the middle of Missoula. And as this advertisement argues, a place that could be very profitable to develop and invest in. But other places are also developing in South Missoula. And the Carline Addition, again, this is a suburb basically that's created and named directly after its connection with the streetcar line that's developing, right? So the whole idea of this suburban development is that you'll be very, very connected to this developing streetcar system. But in addition to sort of making the argument for why their location is a good one, this is kind of out by the mall, Southgate Mall is where the Carline Addition is. They make an implicit argument that I'm sure is directed at the lower Rattlesnake. The Carline Addition, there are no Chinese graveyards, no dangerous rail subways, no creeks to swim to get there, and no rocks to dig out of your yard, all right? So, I mean, clearly, people are very aware of the fact of this lower Rattlesnake being a Chinese graveyard. And it's at this time when you start to see more and more of a kind of a loss of the memory of this being a broader cemetery for all of Missoula, and more of a connection with the lower Rattlesnake as a Chinese graveyard. All right, so. So let's talk a little bit about where some of these graves and bodies were. So again, this is where this is that older plat, but this is where the cemetery was located. And so to look where that would be today, I know this is not very easy to read, but this is Cherry Street here, and this is Harrison, Taylor, Locust. There's Prescott School. There's the interstate, and Mount Jumbo. So just to give you a sense, I mean, it was a pretty big area where this cemetery was. So those are the official boundaries of it, as indicated on these plat maps. But it's not entirely clear where. It's not that they were, people were buried in there in a totally uniform way or anything like that. So there's still an interesting question about where people were buried, where the Chinese were buried versus other people, and so on. And in fact, one of the questions, an interesting question itself is, were the Chinese buried in these formal boundaries of that cemetery? It's still a question that's a little bit up in the air, but as we'll see, all of the sort of bodies that have been found, remains that have been found, graves that have been found so far, as I know, have been found in this boundary area, including ones that were Chinese burials. So I wanted to show you, this map's from 1890-ish, somewhere around there. There aren't a lot of photos, from the 19th century of the lower Rattlesnake. It wasn't a super developed area. So there's the plat maps that tell you where the cemetery was supposed to be, but indicators of where people were actually buried are harder to come by. But this one you can see, this is a view from Mount Jumbo looking down. And let me get a more high-resolution version of this. So there you can see a little bit more. And does anybody know what this building is? Anybody old-time Lower Rattlesnake people? So this was the East Side School. That was the first school in the Lower Rattlesnake. And later, it, of course, becomes Prescott, which is over here, which is also initially known as the East Side School. But that's the first school in the Lower Rattlesnake. So this, and we know that that's on Vine Street. So that's Vine Street there. And I'll scoot back here a little bit. So again, this is Vine Street here. This is probably Poplar somewhere in here. And then Cherry Street would be somewhere in here. And you can see, I mean, there's lots of interesting things to look at in this photo. It looks like a lot of the graves are here. And I know you probably can't see this very well, but there are actually, and I didn't notice this until I got a high resolution photo, but you can see the outlines of the fence. So there is one line of the fence, then it goes this way, and then I'm not sure if you can see it over on this side, but you can see at least these two sides here. And there's graves here. I think these are plots of graves. These are bigger headstones, which give you a sense that, again, well, a decade or so after the new cemetery's been created, there's still a fair amount of headstones here, and it looks like there's headstones back here as well. All right, I'll go back to my... All right, so that gives you some sense that, that would be like in this area here, it looks like, would be where a lot of those were concentrated, with some also back here. But it's hard to tell from that angle of the photo exactly where they would be. But we also have newspaper articles that start to emerge in the 20th century, where as this area is developed, people start finding remains of people or gravestones or coffins and so on. First of those is in 1911, when there's sewer construction that's happening, and this is in the alley block on Poplar, that's bounded by Poplar, Cherry, Harrison, and Taylor. So that is this block here, and it's in the alley, so it's probably somewhere in here. And they dig up a coffin. People that are building the sewer line dig up a coffin. They dig up a skeleton. The newspaper article doesn't really indicate anything else about them. There's no mention of it being a Chinese person or any other kind of race or gender or anything like that. And the coffin is just put back in the ground and covered over. So presumably it's still there. Then in 1913, again, this area is being more and more developed. It's not looking like this yet, but there are more and more houses coming in. And as people are trying to sell plots of land, there's still tombstones there that are getting in the way of them selling this real estate. And one person that's trying to sell some land complains about a tombstone that's on the east end of Cherry Street. So again, this is Cherry Street here. So, I don't know. We don't know exactly where the east end would have been at this time, but probably somewhere down in here. And it's the tomb of a child. And the name, while they mention in this article, again, they're starting at this time already, people are starting to really associate this area with Chinese burial ground. But they also, then they mention that, but they also note that the name on the tombstone is not a Chinese person's name. Also on Cherry Street here, the next year, there's Fred Warden, who I believe was the son of Frank Warden. I'm not sure, I need to look that up, but Frank Warden was, of course, one of the major founders of Missoula. And so Fred Warden was buried in this old cemetery in 1882. He had a pretty good-sized tombstone, and he's left there until 1914. It's not until 1914 until his body and that tombstone is moved to the new cemetery over on the north side. And again, this just mentions it being on Cherry Street, so probably somewhere in here. In 1923, A casket and a skeleton are dug up on an alley between Cherry and Poplar. Again, that's this alley here, right here. And they mentioned that this was a Chinese burial ground, but they also note that the skeleton was 6 feet tall and the jawbone did not appear to be that of a Chinese person. Now, I don't know. They don't say who did this analysis or anything, so who knows? But that was their conclusion, was that it was not a Chinese person. In 1937, they do dig up the remains of a Chinese grave. This is when Works Progress Administration crews are working on leveling Cherry Street. And in the process of doing that, they uncover a coffin that has an inscription on it that says Li Fu Lim is buried here. They find other things in there. They talk about a kimono, which is Japanese, but some sort of Chinese clothing and other accoutrements that indicate a Chinese burial, but no bones in it. So this would have been, probably one of these burials where a person was buried, dug up years later, and then the bones were sent back. I forgot to mention, I think I skipped over this earlier. I want to come back to it for just a second. Oh yeah, so there were, in addition to sort of these attacks on these Chinese funerals, I wanted to mention this part, which was that also in 1891, people in this area in the Lower Rattlesnake started complaining about improper burials made by the Chinese in this period. And they don't go into a lot of detail. They say in the windy season, it was a nuisance. And so this may indicate, so one of the things sometimes happened with Chinese burials was they weren't buried very deeply because the plan was to uncover them in the next couple years and send the bones back. So it's possible that that was one of the sort of outcomes of how the Chinese were burying them, but it also gives the indication that there are, more and more Chinese burials that are happening in that period. All right, I'm going to try to finish up here so we can have some time for some questions. Okay. And this one was, again, it said on Cherry Street between Fillmore and Harrison, which would be on Taylor Street, basically. So somewhere in this area right in here. 1952, a coffin was found. This just says on Taylor Street. And again, the coffin was left there and reburied. So again, still there. In 1955, on 1037 Elm, which is north of this is one that is not in this boundary area. There was a child fell into a sinkhole in a backyard, and there was never any recovery of any or indications of a casket or coffin or human remains or anything, but there was speculation at the time that it may have been a sinkhole created by the earlier burials. But it's not clear that it could have been other things. There was also prospecting that was done around Mount Jumbo, and there's other stories of children falling into old prospectors' holes. So it could be that, or it could be something geological, unrelated to human activity, and so on. But nevertheless, it was one where people talked about, again, about these sort of Chinese burials in this area. And then in 1974, on 119 Cherry Street, which is right here, right there, this house was, they were redeveloping it and excavating in the backyard, and they came across two bodies, an adult and a child skeleton. And at the time, again, they assumed it was Chinese people that had been buried there. But in the early 2000s, anthropologists at the University of Montana analyzed those bones and concluded they were probably Caucasian. And there's been some further research on that. It's unclear who exactly they were, but it may have been an early burial by the McQuirk family, that family that I said that first owned this area. All right, I'm going to end there. And just so we have time for questions. So, yeah, well, let's end there. And what questions do you guys have? Yeah.
Like that photo of yours a few slides before this one gave me the impression that there might be some burial sites on the bench above Prescott.
Oh, well, Prescott would be over here. Yeah. Yeah. It is a little bit, it is on a little bit of a bench. And let's see if I have a topographical, no, I don't. But there is a little bit of a bench there. It's not right up, it's not on the mountain per se, but there is a little bit of a bench there, yeah. Yeah.
Is it possible that there are other pockets around the Rattlesnake where Chinese people went to bury their dead? I've heard that the northeast corner of Pineview Park was Chinese.
Yeah.
And I've heard of other places, and is it possible that the Rattlesnake used to be kind of a wilder place and people would just go and kind of bury their dead in some...
Yeah. Yeah, so the Pineview Park one is the Poor Farm one. So that was definitely one that was that kind of became the major Chinese burial ground sometime in the 1890s, I think. And that continued until, at least until 1910, I think is the last burial I've heard about there, but probably after that as well for a while. I think it's very possible, I mean, the Chinese had lots of different, there was various different religions that Chinese people had, and some of those had beliefs about how people should be buried, and so some of them were, there was a desire to bury them in a certain location relative to mountains and that sort of thing. And I'm not sure if that, if these burials fit that or whatever. But there may have been, there may have been other burials, and they may have, found other places that were good spots for them to bury as well. I mean, I think that they're like the rest of Missoula. They probably wanted areas that were somewhat accessible, and that they sort of had they were buried with other members of their community and so on. But then again, there were some of these other burials that I mentioned, like the one on the north side, that may have been a Chinese person, and it's unclear if that was associated with other burials in that area and so on. So I think it's very possible, but I don't know. Yeah.
Is anyone doing DNA testing?
As far as I know, the only remains that have been collected are those ones that I just mentioned from 119 Cherry Street. I mean, it's very possible there were other ones as well that maybe didn't make it into the news or something like that I don't know about. But there have been other burial sites around Missoula where they've found bones and done DNA testing. But as far as I know, that's the only one that they have done any testing on from this area. Yeah.
There are more than one person here who has a home in that map.
Yeah.
I am one of them. So one of the questions I have is there any grant money so that we could potentially find if there are graves on our property so that we could do restoration?
Yeah. Well, I've been talking with Paul McLeod, who's here, who's a geologist who's done work on with ground penetrating radar to look for graves. So we're interested in exploring that option, and would love to talk with property owners in that area that would be interested in exploring that too. So, okay, that'd be great. Yeah.
Have you ever heard anything about a child's glass window coffin being unearthed in the area?
No, I haven't.
One of the archaeologists who did some work in this area told me that neighborhood lore is that there's a house on Cherry or maybe Taylor that has this kind of weird double tall looking foundation.
Mm-hmm.
The story attached to it was that when they were excavating the foundation,
If I can stop you for a minute, if you grab the microphone.
Oh, sure.
Yes, people back there don't hear.
Sorry, my question for Leif is if he's ever heard tell of a child's glass-windowed coffin being unearthed in the area. Because an archaeologist who did some work in the area told me once that according to neighborhood lore, construction on one house was halted when a child's glass windowed coffin was turned up during excavation, and that they just filled it in and kind of built an extra, concrete pad over the top. Have you ever heard of anything like that?
I have not heard that particular story. I'd be interested to hear more about it. I have heard, I've talked to some people that live in this area, and there's a lot of lore around this sort of stuff, and some people have heard things like houses couldn't be insured and various things like that related to these burial grounds. So I'd be interested in talking with more people from the area about any sort of stories. And one thing I forgot to mention, by the way, related to that is I did talk with the person that used to live in this house before the 1970s, before those skeletons were found. And he grew up here in the 1950s and 60s. And he said that right across, in this area right here, you could at that time see depressions in the ground where graves had been. And he had found one brick which had Chinese lettering on it. And that was one of the ways, then again, when the Chinese would bury people and then dig them up later, and they may not invest as much in a gravestone for the reason that it wasn't intended to be as permanent, but they needed some way of identifying who was there. And so they would make bricks, or sometimes they would be, wooden signs or something like that. Sometimes it would be a bottle with the name on a piece of paper in the bottle or something like that. But in this case, this person said that he had found a Chinese brick over on this side that had that lettering on it. Yeah.
There used to be, or maybe still is, that concrete pylon chained to a chain link fence, or like just locked to a chain link fence at the end of an alley, like between Cherry and, I want to say it's Cherry and Taylor. But last time I went looking for it, I didn't find it. Do you know anything about that? It's sort of a pawn, kind of looks like a pawn, like in chess, kind of an interesting pylon. But last time I looked, I'd heard that no one knew if it was meant to mark a single grave or possibly an entire graveyard, but I couldn't find it when I was looking last.
No, I haven't heard about that either. So how recently did you see that? Okay. Yeah.
I went looking maybe a month ago.
Huh.
I didn't know if I was lost, but I drove around for probably an hour.
Huh.
I couldn't find it where I thought it was.
Yeah,
It could have been somewhere down here, I think.
Huh.
Yeah. Or maybe there, but like one of these alleys that ends on Taylor Street, I think.
Okay.
I just saw something like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Maybe I was just
I
looking
didn't
around.
go down it.
Where did you see it?
I saw it up, I guess, let's see, I think, is this an alley?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw it here.
Oh, okay.
Concrete block, like with a bike lock, basically chained.
Oh, I'm gonna go back and look.
Any other questions?
Is there a member in the Zulu community of Chinese descent who's working on this?
No, there's not. The question was, is there a member in the Missoula community of the Chinese, in the Missoula community that's of Chinese descent that's working on this? There is a person named Paul Kim, who I think is of Korean descent, but he's been one of the people that's been spearheading the memorialization of this in the area. But the part of the problem with this story is that, unlike Native Americans who have, survived many challenges and continue to be in this area, that original Chinese community is gone. And there was some members of that original community from the late 19th century that lasted in Missoula into the 20th century. There was some pretty big families who resided here well into the 40s and maybe 50s, but have eventually all dispersed. And the longer story of that is the story of a lot of persecution that drove a lot of them out. But I have talked to the Sam Tom was one of the his family was one of the very prominent Chinese families in Missoula, and he had like, I think 12 or 13 kids, and most of them were born in Missoula, went to public school here and all that, lived over on the north side and so on. And I just talked with one of his descendants a couple days ago who lives in Arizona, and he has a big family that many of them live in the United States. And so I'm hoping to get them in touch with it's the Historic Preservation Office and the city that's working on this memorial, and I'm hoping to get them in touch with them so there could be some sort of voice from that original community that's giving some input on these memorials.
Where would the memorial be?
I'm not sure exactly. I think it would probably be somewhere on the end of Cherry Street, be my guess. But I think they have to work that out with parks and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Is the practice of moving bodies like a thing in Montana? I'm just thinking about, I don't know, well, you tell me, does it happen in other places?
Yeah.
Just here?
Yeah, it's the question was, is the practice of moving bodies common? And it is pretty common in this period. There are lots of other communities that, had an original cemetery that ends up being moved. Again, there's like just a tremendous amount of pressure from real estate development to expand, and land is very, very valuable. And when communities are first started, the cemetery seems, way on the edge of town, and then within a couple decades, that town is growing. So often they have been moved. They're moved for other reasons too. Like there've been a lot of construction of dams in the 20th century, many of which ended up flooding old cemeteries, and then the bodies would be moved in those cases as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned this is still a work in progress. I'm just curious what the next steps are. What are you looking to continue doing? And if you're still looking in the literature of the past to find more, or if you think you found everything that can be found.
Yeah, the question is what's the next step, and what next steps, and what else might I be looking for? I don't really know. I mean, I sort of got into this, just out of this research on this historical tour and my own personal interest, and it's just a story that has captivated me. So I'm not really sure what the next steps are. I would like to, perhaps work on a grant to develop, to try to find some of these old grave sites. I think there is more that can be done in terms of historical research. I mean, I've done a lot in newspapers and some government documents, but there's probably more that could be done there. I'd like to figure out better the story of property ownership in this area and so on. And there may be stuff, there's some things that are mentioned in some of these newspaper articles, like, the city council formed a committee to look into the disrepair of the old cemetery, or petitions to move bodies, or public health problems with burials there. And there may be, reports or minutes that are buried somewhere in the archives that would be cool to find. So I think there's more there too. Yeah.
Was there anything found when the highway went through, when the freeway went through? Was there anything in that area found?
No, not that I've heard of. That one burial that was over on the north side was, I think it may have been related to the building of the interstate. No, I'm not sure exactly, but no, I haven't come across anything like that. And there was a real attempt. It was called salvage archaeology, to try to find anything that came up when these interstates were being blown through areas. But so people were certainly cognizant of the fact of archaeologists and anthropologists were like aware of the fact that there may be remains that were turned up in the process of that, but also that it's easy that something like that could have been missed as well. But the interstate would have been is to the south of this, so it seems like in terms of this original burial ground and where the Chinese were mostly burying people in the lower Rattlesnake, that interstate would have missed that. Yeah.
Two questions. Do you know if people had to pay for the plot? And then the second question is, when we think of the second question?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that's what I don't really fully understand how this early cemetery worked in terms of the ownership and management of it. My impression is that basically it was pretty undeveloped land that was quite a ways away from the city when it first started being used. And whoever was the owner of it, the McQuirks, is a lot of the titles to this land early on are McQuirk, Warden, Woody, the major sort of elite in Missoula, who my sense is they allowed, there was a need for a burial ground. You have to have a burial ground, a public burial ground in a developing city, and that they sort of just allowed that to happen there for the time being until something was figured out, and that they probably didn't charge anything for it, and it probably wasn't really, strongly managed or anything, and that's why you see fundraisers to try to raise money to build a fence and then after that constant concern about falling into disrepair. Unlike the new cemetery that was built in 1884 was built by the Missoula Valley Improvement Company, and it was built, it was a business venture. So I think it was a very different thing than this earlier one.
The second question was, what's the modern protocol if you find something in your back?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I think you want to alert the coroner, the county coroner, and then the coroner and may also alert the anthropology department or something like that. I think you could do both, but I think the coroner is the main person to start with. Unless anybody else knows differently and wants to let me know. Yeah.
Can you tell us about your podcast?
Sure. It's called Death in the West, so it's related. So Death in the West is a podcast that I do with a couple other friends and my sister. All of us are from Missoula, and it's sort of orbits around a death in some way, but tries to use that death and mysteries around that death to tell a bigger story about the history of the American West. So our first season is about the murder of Frank Little, who was a union organizer who was lynched in Butte in 1917, and nobody was ever accused or formally accused of the crime, let alone convicted of it. There's lots of theories about it, including the very powerful Anaconda Company. But so we talk about, so we use his death as a way of talking about the labor and capital struggles in the late 19th and early 20th century American West. Our second season, we wanted to do something different, except it still has to be related to death. So we did skyjacking, and a lot of which happened in the American West. And one in particular that was carried out by a guy named Richard McCoy, who may or may not have been a guy also known as D.B. Cooper. So they were talking about the later 20th century West. And on Wednesday, I think it's Wednesday, we're going to be doing a live show from the library here if you want to come. And we'll be recording it, and it'll be a sort of one-off episode. It's part of the big read that's going on with the library. But it's going to be about a strange murder in Missoula and an even stranger aftermath to that murder. It has to do with burial grounds and burials and maybe the unburying of people. So if you want to come check that out. If you're interested in more of that, you can come check it out. Yeah. It's here. I think it's in this room or that room. I'm not sure, or maybe that's going to be both. I should have brought more details about it. It's at 6 to 8. Yep.
October 11th, between 6 and 8 on this floor.
Thank you. October 11th, between 6 and 8 on this floor. Any other questions? Yeah.
I know at the Helena and Butte cemeteries, on the outskirts or in the corners, where the children and orphans are buried, they found Chinese
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So the different cemeteries in different towns incorporated or didn't incorporate the Chinese into their cemeteries in different ways. In some cases, they're usually segregated, and in some cases, they are within the sort of formal cemetery boundaries, but still segregated from other people. In other cases, they're outside of the formal cemetery boundaries. In this case, it's a little, it's not clear to me, again, like there's clearly some overlap in the burial of people in here, and definitely some overlap in where they're buried. And you don't see, while there's complaints about some, as I mentioned, some complaints about like these Chinese burials in 1891, you don't see complaints, I haven't seen complaints yet about the Chinese burying people too close to non-Chinese people. And it's not clear to me if the official cemetery that was created in 1884 was open to the Chinese or not, or they just preferred to bury them. I mean, again, one of the, that again was a different business model. That was where people were being charged for plots. And again, because the Chinese, were often, the plan was to unearth people and send them back. They often didn't want, they paid a lot, as you saw from these descriptions of these funeral processions. They spent enormous amounts of money on these processions. They would hire bands to play. They'd always have music there. They spent a lot of money on it, but they didn't want to spend money, sometimes didn't want to spend money on paying for grave plots because they weren't intended to be a long-term thing. So anyways, it's not clear to me if the official cemetery created in 1884 was open to the Chinese or closed. I haven't found any indication either way, and whether the Chinese had an interest in burying people there. It's later you see, the Tom family that I mentioned, there's a number of members of their family are buried in the cemetery, and that starts as early as the 19-teens. So at least by that time there were Chinese in Missoula that were being buried in that official cemetery. Any other questions? Yeah.
Leif, I was wondering if you've ever heard about a Chinese restaurant in Toon downtown or in Newark.
No.
West Main Street.
Uh-huh.
Like not too far from Jay's, between the old Jay's and Low Club.
Uh-huh.
There's reportedly a Chinese restaurant that's been totally built around, but you can see a piece of it from the little deck behind.
Oh, really? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that I'd be interested to learn more about that. There was, there's a lot of lore around underground Chinese stuff, and a lot of that is kind of legend. But there are also clearly, that happened with buildings, all kinds of buildings, where you'd have an original building. One of the early people that came in as a trader in the lower Rattlesnake was named William Hamilton, and he built his sort of shack over near here. And then it was encased in a bigger building that was actually torn down in the creation of this library. But so that happened. There are other times when you see you do see there was the building of sort of underground things. But this was something at ground level that was covered in. Okay, it could be, but I would wonder why.
I think newer would be the right word.
Okay.
There's no walls around it, kind of sealed it in.
Yeah. It seems, well, I would like to hear more about it. I mean, it seems like somebody would want to use that space rather than just...
You can read about it in that book. I think it's called...
Yeah. Uh-huh. Okay, I'll have to check that out. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
It's because they were leveling the streets and they actually had to fill it in.
Oh, so it wasn't at ground level, it was...
It was, and then they built over it. They just put street over it.
On Higgins, I think they did.
I think it was her name.
On Main as well.
They didn't... There's a conception that this happened in some other cities where they raised the level of the streets. That didn't happen in Missoula, so it wasn't that.
What they did in England in a couple of places and in Scotland was where the plague was raging. They built walls all around it.
Uh-huh.
No one could get out. That's where they...
Wow. a pest house that was up. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was a poor farm and the pest house were there. Yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you guys.